welcome back. It's Christine again with the Artist Pod, and today I'm going to talk about how to draw a lion. So let's get started. Alright, so just like we always do, we start with that basic sketch. It's going to look a bit rough. And I know that I mentioned it in one of the videos, but just to zoom in and sort of show you how I'm layering up the lines here, right? Like it's always a line with a line in between, and a line in between that. And so all the lines are spreading out so that they are in between each other. That's how you layer up the very first kind of base. That's what's going to give that sort of believability to the hair, that it's not just one line coming down, but that they're all sort of staggered like that. And that's how you get that fur effect. All right. And then we're going to get the ear and the mane. So he's going to look a little rough here. And we start flushing that mane out. All right, so this is kind of the basic sketch, which looks a bit rough. I add in the mouth a little, the mouth and the nose a little later, because I was trying to get the basic shape of his face done. And then I start layering up. So here, once I add this layer, I've started layering up, right? But even here, this is kind of the same, but not as much, because the strokes are much longer, right? So I can do a little bit more freeform with them, but I can be a lot looser with it because I don't have to be as particular as I'm going because the hair's so long. But again, I am still, even though the hair's long, I am still layering in the middle where it makes sense, which is often because you want to do that as much as possible. That's what's going to lend it its believability. Even with the mane, even though that's longer. And that's going to allow us, so, you know, once we lay this down and we're getting all of this fur in the right direction, because that's really the most important part, and the same is true with the mane, when I start adding the highlights, I'm following that, you know, I already know this is how it goes, so I'm going to layer on that color really thickly and just follow the direction of the hair I've already drawn on the lion. Or on any animal I'm doing, whether that's the mane and it's long, or whether that's the face. And then we add that second layer of the mane there. Now I am going to add, before I forget it's down here, this little spot. I didn't add it there. Sometimes layer order, because I work in Photoshop, is important. So if I think something is necessary but maybe too bright, I'll put it under other layers, and as I build up the other colors it won't be nearly as bright, but I'm going to go ahead and pop it on because it's way down here, and as we go I'm probably going to forget about it. So his mane was almost too controlled, which is why I added, you know, these fluffy bits coming out a little bit more and just sort of randomly place them in so that I would push the drawing of the mane a little bit further out as I went, made it look a little bit more mussed up. All right, and then I added lighter, right here, a lighter bit of color under his eyes, because they're not all just this golden color, right? Like they have a little splashing of black and sort of a lighter brownish tan color. And now I'm going to really start layering in the highlights here. Without his mouth, he looks really weird, I know. But in this case, I have my light source coming in on this side, right? So we have, you know, the light coming in over here. And just like we do with everything, we can break this down into its general shape. So we have this oval for the face, which, you know, his mouth is open, so it's pushing his face even further down. We have, you know, a bulge for his eyes right here because those are circular, but they're going to be almost a half circle because his nose is pushing up, right? Like we have this because he's wrinkling his muzzle as he's sort of growling at us, his nose pushes up into the circular part of his eyes. And even still, you know, we have this circle, we have these smaller circles, we have the reverse triangle for the nose, right? Like all of this is how we break all of that down. And we would shadow all of that appropriately. But you can still see, you know, even though the light source is over here, as I've mentioned a million times before, they're still going to be catching the light, especially because his face is more wrinkly, right? So the muscles in his face and the way he's sort of growling are pulling his cheek up. And so it's going to catch more of that light because of how it's going to wrinkle his face. And then we have, in order to get this effect, to make him look like he's growling at us, we need these sort of wrinkled sections on his nose where the wrinkles sort of come in. We have a wrinkle through here. We have a little bit of wrinkling this way. We have where the face is pulling up the cheeks a bit. And all of that wrinkling helps add to the effect that he's angry. He's sort of growling at us. But all of those can also be broken down by shape, right? So you have like little almost ovals and these little swoops and, just how would you sort of break it down and shadow appropriately, because that's what I'm doing. Every single hump has, there's shadow on this side and highlight on this side, shadow on this side, highlight on this side, same here, shadow on, so always shadowed on that back edge and highlighted on that front edge. So every single little hump in his nose has that. And so you can break that down by shape as well, especially when you start getting into those sort of more complicated facial expressions. And then, so again, lions have that almost, it's not white, I wouldn't say, but it's a lighter color, and that's what I just added around his nose and his chin. And now we start adding in the mouth, right? So whenever I'm doing a cat who's growling, there's going to be a gap all around, because as they open their mouths, you're going to have like the gums and that gum line, and we'll be able to see that. And the same is true for underneath. We're going to have, and then the sides of the mouth as well. We're going to have all of that seeable, but it's going to be, either a black or a pinkish color. To create the teeth shape, though, it's not that hard. Teeth are actually relatively easy. So I find it, easiest to figure out where my baseline is going to be, and then go from the tip and go backwards, right? You go from the tip, you make the lines, and then you sort of spread out from there. Tip, make the lines. Same for these. The bottom ones have a little bit of a curve to them because of how we're seeing them. And so, they kind of come down in this curve fashion. And then the same thing, right? Like we have the light coming down. You'll notice my color here, right? Like it's not the white color I typically use. It's more of an off color. So teeth, like eyes, like we have the whites of the eyes, but teeth is kind of the same in that they're not going to be pure white. The whites of our eyes we never see as being pure white. They're not. Because they have so much shadow coming in on them, they're grayish. The same is true for the lion. Like their teeth aren't going to be showing as a pure white. You'll see it on a lot of animals. It's a little bit yellowish. It's a little bit orangish. There's going to be that tint in there. One, because it's in shadow, it's recessed into their mouths, but also because the teeth aren't purely white. They're staining on that, just that bit. So when you're doing teeth, if you use a pure white, I find that it looks jarring because that's not really an accurate color for what an animal's teeth really kind of does. So finding an off color, it's still light. You still want it to be lighter and show up as a lighter color, but it's not going to be kind of the pure white that that we would think of it as. All right, and see, then we add the pink. And then, you have the tongue in here, and I was lightly trying to indicate the tongue. So the tongue, as I was going further back into the mouth, I always try to feather that out so the mouth becomes a black recess. And so I try to be careful on how far back I think it's going to go and where specifically I think the light's really going to catch, which is where I made these lines here. And not fully, like I have the lines on the back to indicate space when I need it to, but as much as possible limiting that, at least in the initial sketch, until I sorted out exactly how I was going to flesh out the highlights and shadows. I limit how much I draw down, especially on something going into a mouth where I may be making drastic changes even to a basic sketch in order to make it look realistic. And while it's not here, I can guarantee you I probably did more and then backed off on it and erased out some of that sketch. I don't remember now. It's been too long since I've drawn it, but I very likely added a lot more here and then used the select tool to erase it as I thought maybe it was too much. All right, now I don't know if you can see what I did here, but I added just a little burst of light right above his eyes. And some of that is to catch the light, just like I have that orange that's sort of layered here. And some of that's just that lighter color, catching the light, that lighter color. There's a mix of things that I do with this drawing that really help make it pop. And then we really flesh out those lighter sections under his eyes, the burst of lighter color right by his nose and on his chin that lions have, right? Like it's really starting to add those highlights and shadows to flesh him out. Now, see here, just like I did with the burst over his eyes, I'm adding this sort of lighter color throughout his face to lighten him up. I don't often do that with animals, but sometimes I do, and I added it even through here, some more of it, so that it's a slight color difference from his base, but adding in, just like we did with the person when we added in those very loose, lighter lines, you can add a little bit of color without having to fully flesh it out. You can see they're sort of loose, right? Like they're very sparsed out. But it'll work to lighten him. Let's pull it back and I can flash that on and off again. Because it's light enough and we pick up that difference enough, it makes a pretty big difference. And so I use it anywhere that the light would be highlighting. On the nose here, you can see anywhere that the light would be highlighting on all of his little wrinkles. On the backside of his eye here, on his forehead, around his wrinkles on his forehead. So all of that's just meant to give him a burst of highlight. And then we start really fleshing out the mane. And just like with, the head, we have a shape here. We have this, ovular shape where we have shadow and highlight. Now, because of the way his mane is, though, too, right? Like we have this section where his mane kind of flops over. And so we have this section in highlight, but we're going to have this, and the part of his forehead that is under this will be in shadow because his hair is blocking that. So there's going to be a bit of shadow right where his hair's coming in. There's also a little bit of shadow right through here where his mane fluffs out and potentially casts a little bit of a shadow around him, around where it connects back in, because it's going to be pushing potentially more forward than his face. And so I include that as well. And then I start fleshing out his ears. So we had this ear in place, and this one I added in kind of on the fly. With a lion's mane, you can often see their ears, but it's limited as to how much. And honestly, the least I have to do, the better there, that I don't have to put more work into doing something major. So I left this ear being relatively small, but his mane is sort of flipped that way, so that would make sense. Because I need to make sure that his ears would be roughly in comparison with how long they are on either side. But typically they're going to be, which I didn't fully do because his mane's in the way, but typically they're going to be rounded for a lion. They're going to be these rounded little fluffs. And over here even I have his ear almost turned, which is why it's doing that. And then we fluff it out more. But the importance of putting the ear there as we fluff out the mane is that it creates just enough visual cue to us that we know his ear is there, even though for the most part we can't see it. But what it did for me over here was it allowed me to take the mane and have the mane flopping over the ear. So even though it's kind of jutted out here, you can still see it. The mane kind of flops over it and hides a good portion of it. And likewise over here, the mane's in front of the ear, but you can still see the ear is there, even if it's just a subtle little hint of the ear. And now his eyes. Zoom in here. You know, you can see that I just did full pin pressure as I came around. I didn't do my standard. Now, the other thing with a lion in this particular pose is his eyes are small because he's sort of, you know, he's zoomed in on us. He's narrowed in on where we are. So his eyes are really narrow. He's growling at us. We have his full attention. And his pupil size, therefore, is a lot smaller. I added the dark line on the edge because I didn't feather it out the way I do now. This was actually an earlier iteration of my drawing style. So I didn't quite feather it out in the same way, and so because of that I added a dark line along the back edge there. It's right here. And then the squiggles that I do now for humans, I did that. And the lighter version. And then the highlight. You can see once you add the highlight really makes his eyes there. And then we start working on fleshing out the teeth. Right, so when you're doing that, again, I'm mindful of the fact the light source is coming from above and to the right. So there's going to be shadow here on the tops of these teeth. And in fact, here I even leave the gap. Because, you know, this is casting a shadow, right? There's a shadow all through here. Likewise here, the tops of the teeth are what's going to be in highlight because they're going up towards the light source where it's going to round down into shadow. And as we kind of come over this way, right, the back side of this tooth isn't as filled in because that's in shadow and sort of so on and so forth. So keeping in mind your light source, even when you're doing the mouth, being aware that there would be some amount of shadow cast by his upper lip and the gum line before you get to the teeth. But by the time you get to the middle, you know, some of that light likely would be hitting his teeth. And so really what you want to flesh out is that middle section of his mouth. And then you add the same for the gums. And you feather out, you can see I feathered out through here, but left that burst of highlight. So his tongue, when a cat's doing this, really any animal, you see it with a dog too, his tongue is going to be curved up because it's curving against the raised gum line here. So these teeth over here and the gum line are catching it a bit, which is raising this side. And this side is going to be sort of rounding down, doing that opposite. So you're going to have potentially some spots that are rounding up over the gum line that are going to catch a highlight, but it is going to go in shadow as it goes down into his mouth. And then just sort of adding, it doesn't take much, but you can add, you can see what I did here where I just feathered out the lines, that pinkish color for his tongue as it went back into his throat. And then add it in his nose. And added the highlights, right? So we have that triangle of the nose. And then he also has that little burst coming down. And adding shadows and highlights. You know, feathering it out as it comes underneath. So making sure that nostrils it rounds down is a little bit more in shadow. Adding what I like to do on a lot of noses, human, animal, doesn't matter, is to have a few lines coming up into the darker section because it's really effective way, just like we did with the tongue down here, it's an effective way to show that you're going into a recessed area by lessening those lines but still having them a little bit present. Going into black, you give the sensation or the illusion of depth as it's disappearing into effectively a cave of his nostrils or his mouth. It's receding into something that is much darker. And then I add the gray. So I added a lot of gray around his nose, but it was more important to do around the section of his mouth here, because otherwise the pink, while okay, I think this added a lot to his mouth because they have that black coming off. And then adding those highlights, and you can see here, you know, like the highlights on the gum line are going to follow that curvature, right? Like it's going to catch the light because the gum line's going to come in here. It's going to be darker, but it's going to recatch the light as it rounds back out. And then it remains dark, you know, very sparse on this side, but a little bit more filled in on this side. As much as I can, I try to leave the black, which is what I've done. And then I added this burst of orangish to his mane to sort of give him that extra pop. It's the same thing I did here, where I added that little bit of orangish, but I buried it under all the layers so that it didn't quite catch as much. It wasn't overpowering, I should say. I probably drew it originally and it was overpowering, which is why I moved the layer. And then overall, this extra little very light burst of orange kind of throughout to, you know, make him warmer and more saturated there. And then whiskers, so he's angry, so his whiskers are coming out more sparse, right? Like it's just, again, it's just, you don't put a lot of pin pressure, you just sort of lightly do it and you draw out whiskers. And make them nice and splayed. So I don't have any coming underneath because he's growling, right? He's angry. So I have them more spread out. And then the last thing we do is sign it. All right, so that is how you draw a lion. If you did have any questions or comments, please drop them down below. If you did like this video, please like and subscribe, and I will see you all next Thursday. Thank you so much.